I want to say that we are so grateful for having the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Lee Walton with us on this morning to share his reflections that he entitled A Fragile Experiment, an Enduring Faith. As you know, Dr. Walton has been president of Princeton Theological Seminary since 2023, and he frankly is a friend and an honorary Presby Baptist member of the Presbytery of Philadelphia. Amen? As a brief bio of Dr. Walton's journey and accomplishments in your reading materials on page 11, we invite you to read it at your leisure, but just a few things. Dr. Walton's trained as a social ethicist whose scholarship is focused on the intersection of evangelical Christianity, mass media, and political culture. He is the author of 2 books, Watch This, The Ethics and Aesthetics of Black Televangelism, and A Lens of Love, Reading the Bible in its World for Our World. I really commend that book to all of you. I can say a whole lot more. He's an alum of Princeton Seminary, MDiv, PhD. He served as the dean at Wake Forest before he came home to Princeton Theological Seminary as its president. Friends, I just am so overjoyed to introduce him. Please, let's receive him with a warm welcome, Dr. Walton.
To God be the glory for the wonderful things that God has done. What a joy and a privilege it is to be here with you, here in Philadelphia. Yes, this is indeed my presbytery. I am, as so many of you know, I'm Baptist but Presbyterian adjacent. And it's with the beautiful people of this presbytery that have always made me feel so at home and welcomed. And to my dear friend Ruth, this actually came up. We were just having coffee in my office, and she said, I got an idea. And for those of you who know, when Ruth says, I got an idea, you just say, uh-oh. But anytime she says she has an idea, my ears perk up because I know that it's going to be creative and I know that it's going to demonstrate a commitment to God's people. And so it's an honor and a privilege to be here with so many of you, people who I look up to, people who are doing the heavy lifting of ministry, who are doing the heavy lifting of pastoral care, particularly at such a, how can I describe it? Such a mercurial moment in the life of our nation's history. Such a peculiar time when we are trying to wrestle and put up guardrails around what's already and has always and already been a fragile experiment in democracy in this nation. And what's our responsibility as people of faith? And that's what I just want to share for a few moments. When I think about the question, how might a democracy endure? I'm not sure there's a better place to ask this question or pose this question than the city of Philadelphia. Few cities carry the weight of American history like Philly. Few cities embody both the ideals and capture the contradictions like this one. Philadelphia, the place from where the Declaration of Independence announced to the world that all people were created equal, imbued and endowed by our Creator with inherent dignity and immense possibility. Philadelphia, the place where revolutionary ideals were transformed into durable institutions, institutions intended to protect us from oppressive tyranny and despotic terror. Philadelphia. For generations, communities have wrestled with the extraordinary promise and the undeniable precarity and enduring hope in an otherwise fragile experiment. And when I consider the best of this fair city, I personally tend not to think of Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, or other founding fathers as intelligent and passionate as they may have been. For my mind goes to other framers of democracy. I think of men like William Still and James Miller McKim. For long before Congress amended the Constitution, these Philadelphia Presbyterians were already practicing a more expansive vision of liberty. At Lombard Street Central Presbyterian Church, Elder William Still found the spiritual and moral resources to risk life and limb to both deliver and document the story of God's children that he helped to clandestinely liberate. Across the city, Princeton Seminary graduate and Presbyterian pastor James Miller McKim organized anti-slavery societies, organized school, and was present with a crowbar when Henry Box Brown shipped himself from slavery in Richmond to freedom in Philadelphia. Freedom may not have been protected by the law, but freedom was championed by faithful people. Before justice became public policy, it was a practice of faith enacted in church basements, family homes, and often secretly but earnestly within congregations. And I make this point to be clear about a core conviction. America has never been sustained by its founding documents alone. The Declaration of Independence is a remarkable document. The Constitution remains one of the most extraordinary political achievements in human history. As Walter Isaacson attests in the title of his book, the opening line of the Declaration of Independence is among one of the greatest sentences ever written. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yes, Thomas Jefferson did his thing with that. But neither parchment nor institutions possess moral agency. Constitutions can't love neighbors. Courts cannot cultivate compassion. Elections cannot produce virtue. Democracies do not sustain themselves. People sustain democracies or not. This is why America's experiment in democracy has always been a fragile and a fickle one. Why? Because people are fallen, frail, and fickle. People are fragile. And because people are fragile, institutions are fragile. And because institutions are fragile, democracies are always fragile. French philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville, his observations in the mid-19th century have proven remarkably insightful. He taught us that America's democracy cannot rely solely on laws and institutions. Democracy depends on habits, associations, and shared moral commitments. He recognized that churches, schools, voluntary associations, local communities were quietly accomplishing something that government alone can never achieve. These voluntary organizations, like your congregations, are always and already forming citizens for democracy. I get something that has become really a staple for me, particularly since I've been in this role as president or head of the complaint department of Princeton Seminary. It's something that I really understand in a way, and that is the importance of formation. You're going to hear me talk about this all morning. And maybe it's because formation has become increasingly important to me, because maybe it's because we live in a society that has become increasingly obsessed with information. We live in a culture enamored with technocratic hubris. We have more knowledge available than any civilization in human history. Artificial intelligence can summarize books, generate essays, retrieve facts, answer our questions in seconds. Information. But information isn't the same as insight. Just like intelligence and wisdom are not synonyms for one another. Mere smartness is knowing what to say. Wisdom is knowing when to say it, how to say it, and most importantly, why to say it. Information concerns that which we can know, recite, and regurgitate. Insight is about that we can understand and that we can interrogate. Yet if we are going to move from information to insight or intelligence to wisdom, then the question is not just about what we know or what we can do. We have to concern ourselves more and first with who shall we be? Who are we to become? And when we look across the increasingly and extremely partisan and polarized political landscape, the deepest crises confronting our nation aren't just about political disagreements. I believe they're really about a crisis of formation in this nation. It's the difference between ideological polarization and what political scientists call affective polarization. Ideological polarization are judgments about policy and issues. It's the things, the economic policies that you and I may disagree about. But affective polarization, it's about judgments about identity, about humanity, about who is fit even to be a part of a democratic institution. Ideological polarization is about what we know, what we believe rationally, cognitively. Affective polarization, it's about how we feel about ourselves and how we feel about one another. One's debating political matters, the other is debating merits of recognition. What's it even mean to be made in the imago Dei, or the image of God? That's why affective polarization frames disagreements as existential threats, because we don't frame our disagreements about what we oppose as it relates to debates. No, we frame our disagreements about, you're not my opponent, you are my arch enemy. And therefore, I must destroy you before you destroy me. It's a winner-takes-all politics and approach. And this is why so many of us are even willing to use undemocratic means in a professed aim to save democracy. We're willing to undercut freedom in the name of freedom. existential threat. And unless I cut you off at the knees, I don't know if we'll be able to save tomorrow, because clearly you or some people somewhere over there, out there, aren't fit to be a part of the body politic. And then we wonder why we're more prone to view our neighbors with suspicion rather than charity. We wonder why public discourse and algorithms reward outrage over understanding. It seems to me that the institutions that we have in our community today that can cultivate patience, humility, sacrifice, and teach us something about mutual obligation, these institutions have weakened at the very moment we need these institutions the most. That's why I remain convinced that education, particularly faith-based education, is among the most sacred tasks entrusted to any society. This is why it's my honor and my privilege to serve as the chief steward of Princeton Theological Seminary. This is why anytime I get the opportunity, I want to be in community with you, the wonderful people of the Presbytery of Philadelphia, because you're doing the heavy lifting of formation. You are upholding this sacred task and this sacred call. And by sacred, I don't mean just simply religious in a narrow parochial sense. Let me be clear about that. By sacred, I mean the activities which communities transmit meaning, which we cultivate human dignity, and we prepare people to live responsibly with one another. Because if I believe you're sacred, because you were made in the imago Dei of God, that means for you and I to be in relationship with one another is a sacred task. Let me be clear now. I'm not saying you got to like everybody. Let me be clear. I don't want anybody to think I'm up here being sentimental or being Pollyannish. I want to be clear about that. God calls us to love our enemies, agape, love as an ethic, love with my will, even when I can't love with my heart or my emotion. But the love is grounded in recognition. I see you. I see you as a child of God. And therefore, even if you and I don't hang out together, I understand that you are worthy and that your humanity should be affirmed just like my humanity should be affirmed. That's what we learn. That's what Christian education ought to teach at its foundation. Education, it's always been more than just proselytization. It's more than just about, in my case, vocation, finding a job. Freedom and democracy are mounted on the door frames of education. Education is the key to liberation. I know this because I inherited that conviction long before I ever became a professor. I come from a religious tradition that regarded education as a sacred undertaking. Education that happened in church basements and education that happened at the local public schools. These were the communities that nurtured me, from Atlanta, Georgia to Raleigh, North Carolina. Education wasn't about employment, it wasn't about credentials, it wasn't just about economic mobility, though certainly education contributes to all three. But education was understood as a pathway to freedom. It unlocked doors of opportunity, and it widened the horizons of democratic participation. In her book, historian Sarah Caroline Thusen, she has a book entitled Greater Than Equal: African American Struggles for Schools and Citizenship in North Carolina, 1919 to 1965. And in this book, Thusen gives the history of desegregation movements along the long civil rights movement in North Carolina. And in the book, she recounts the story of an African Methodist Episcopal civic leader by the name of John Curtis Washington. Following Brown versus Board of Education, Washington would get dressed in his Sunday best, and he would attend the local school board meetings in Raleigh. And there at those local school board meetings, before they would take his time away, he would stand up and he would press school board members to fulfill the promises of desegregation from the Brown decision. Often at his side was his daughter, Rose Marie. That civic leader, John Curtis Washington, was my grandfather. That young girl accompanying him, Rose Marie, was my mother. And though living under the burdens of Jim Crow, my grandfather and countless others drew upon religious traditions that taught them that the prevailing logic of power and privilege was neither ultimate or absolute. What we see now is not always and forever. Because for John Curtis Washington and for so many others, faith and education constituted the twin pillars of democratic hope and possibility. Even if it's a not now, we declare it's a not yet. The quest for literacy and learning was an extension and an expression of the faith. And where these precious people had every reason and empirical evidence to warrant losing hopes due to the pains, problems, perils, and perplexities that they faced in an unjust society in America, they still had something more than the pains and perils that they faced. They possessed a conception of the divine and of the sacred and sacred narratives that inverted the prevailing logics of power, privilege, and persecution. They knew that in God's kingdom, the last can be first, and the first can be the last. They knew in God's kingdom that one living on the margins and minoritized has as much value as the 99 who sit at the center of mainline privilege. This is what my undergraduate institution of Morehouse College, coupled with my graduate studies at Princeton Theological Seminary, imbued in me confidence, self-esteem, provided an external armor hewn from an internal dignity and sense of worth, what Howard Thurman referred to famously as that sense of somebodyness. I'm talking about formation. My grandfather understood that something that many of us, I believe, have forgotten today. That education is one of democracy's primary engines. It expands our moral imagination before it expands opportunity. It expands our capacity to see ourselves in one another. And this is the same conviction that has animated so many of our churches. Particularly, again, I think about the tradition that I come from, the African American Protestant tradition. Now, people like to argue that black churches have always played a role in abolition, Reconstruction, the civil rights movement, countless struggles for justice. I think that's right. But I would actually suggest something more fundamental. Before black churches mobilized people for democracy, they formed people for democracy. There's a huge difference. Long before African Americans possessed the legal rights of citizenship, black churches proclaimed through the theological truth that every person already possessed dignity. Long before black citizens could vote, churches taught parliamentary procedure through church conferences. Long before public schools welcomed black children equally, congregations established schools, cultivated literacy, organized mutual aid societies, developed leaders, nurtured habits of responsibility. Before democracy recognized black people, black churches taught black people that they were already recognized by God. This is the theological claim that changes everything. Because once we form people to believe that they bear the image of God, it becomes remarkably difficult to dehumanize anybody. Once communities are convinced that every human being possesses sacred worth, unjust systems lose their moral legitimacy. Politics asks who possesses the power. Faith asks who possesses dignity. And the answer to the second question should always transform the first question. My friends, churches, the work that you do day in and day out, you are leading among the few remaining institutions that still gather people across generations. Churches are among the spaces that can teach people forgiveness in a culture of resentment, that can teach gratitude in an economy of endless consumption. Churches can teach humility in an age of self-promotion and brand enhancement. This is the work that you are called to do. Our communities can remind all of us that freedom divorced from responsibility is just self-indulgence. Justice divorced from love is nothing but vengeance. Patriotism divorced from repentance is nothing but crass idolatry. So America's experiment, my friends, has always been fragile. It's always been weak. But fragile things don't have to be weak things, because it can be fragile. But when faithful people choose generation after generation to sustain ourselves, even if we're fragile, we have faith, hope, and love, and we know that those things endure. Thank you so much.
Keep it going for Dr. Walton. Now we are going to have a few respondents come and speak around their thoughts of that message. We're going to ask that Reverend Dr. Baron Mullis from First Pres come, and Reverend Sudie Niesen Thompson from Abington Pres, and Reverend Dr. Eustacia Moffett Marshall also come from New River. Following this, Dr. Walton's going to have the last word after the respondents, and then we'll be moving into worship from there. So do not dash off, do not run away. You'll probably have a few minutes as we kind of begin to set up, but we're moving right into worship to begin the rest of our day.
Ruth gave us 390 words to respond, and so I have written my remarks out to make sure I comply with that. Dr. Walton, I hope you will consider imitation indeed to be a sincere form of flattery, as what I'm going to say largely repeats what you said, just with different illustrations. As the pastor of a congregation whose membership included 3 signers of the Declaration, I am mightily cognizant of the paradox of profoundly faithful Presbyterians carrying profound flaws. Our adult education at First Church this fall will include a visit from William Ewald to discuss one of those signers, James Wilson, who is currently having a moment as a forgotten framer, with scholars suggesting that Madison used much of his material in drafting the Constitution. He was, by many counts, a brilliant man. He was adamantly opposed to slavery, yet in the end we know that by his own lobbying, the Constitution accommodated the sin of slavery. A profoundly faithful Presbyterian carrying a profound flaw. I am grateful for Dr. Walton's insight into the ways that formation helps us to carry the church in difficult times, particularly the means by which the Black churches proclaimed the theological truth that every person already possessed God-given dignity. And I confess that your words about our nation and about formation cause me to reflect on our own denomination's history, particularly those times while seeking to be profoundly faithful, we too nonetheless carried profound flaws. The fights over the ordination of women in the mid-20th century, for example, it is hard to make a claim of reinforcing dignity while vocation is denied. And I've heard some stories from some of the first generation of women to ascend the pulpit that would be enough to put you right off the church. Likewise, the alphabet soup amendments of the late 90s and all of the aughts were around the question of full inclusion of LGBTQIA people in the church and in ministry. And when I think back on some of those Presbyterian meetings, dignity is not the first word that comes to mind. And yet, somehow folks stuck with the church, seeking, if I may borrow from the Constitution, to perfect our union. And I have to assume, in light of that fact, that somehow, amidst the words that did not help, and amidst the words that did not heal, somehow enough gospel made its way through our imperfect proclamations to keep people going. And that is what really good formation does. When we are confronted with profound flaws, we nonetheless feel enough responsibility for the community that formed us, enough gospel hope to persevere in doing the work to which God has called us. That's how a church endures. That's how any community endures. And if we're very fortunate and work very hard, that is how democracy endures. Thank you so much.
Friends, I am the Reverend Sudie Niesen Thompson. I serve alongside the Abington congregation established in 1714. Thank you, Dr. Walton, for your thought-provoking and inspiring remarks. I am intrigued by your claim that the deepest crises confronting our nation are fundamentally crises of formation. And I believe that communities of faith are uniquely suited and uniquely called to form people who affirm the God-given dignity of others. One way we do this in an age of polarization is by holding fast to one another, despite differences that threaten to pull us apart. Dr. Walton placed churches among the few remaining institutions that still gather people across generations. I would add that churches are one of the few places where people of diverse, sometimes divergent, political perspectives still choose to do life together, bound by something deeper than politics, our enduring faith in God. While shared belief in Christ creates a particular bond, I've also seen how a shared commitment to faith itself has served to form people of moral courage. 5 years after World War II, when the world was coming to terms with the tragic consequences of a politics of dehumanization, the saints of Abington Presbyterian partnered with a nearby synagogue to hold an interfaith Thanksgiving service. Jews and Christians came together to worship, forming a wider community grounded in the theological truth that every person already possessed God-given dignity. That service became a tradition, and over the years, the circle of participants has expanded to include other churches and an Islamic center. It has not always been easy to maintain the ties that bind diverse communities, especially as political events strain relationships between people of different faiths and no doubt different political persuasions, but they've endured. Last November, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of that service. Governor Shapiro joined us for that milestone and shared a story that underscores the importance of forming people and communities that cultivate a different way of living in the world. Shapiro referenced the attack on the governor's residence during Passover last year. His family later hosted a luncheon for first responders who'd come to their aid. During that gathering, the president of Penn Township Fire Department approached the governor to introduce his father, a Christian chaplain, who presented a letter on behalf of the department. After Shapiro read that message, Chaplain Wordle asked him to turn over the letter. Handwritten on the back were these words: "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." As it happens, this prayer is the one the governor recites over his children every single night. For him, it is the most important prayer in Jewish tradition. Shapiro was moved to tears to know that a man of another faith and another political party would offer him this particular blessing. That's our common humanity, Governor Shapiro shared during that interfaith service. Recognizing, affirming, celebrating our common humanity is one of the ways we address the deepest crises facing our nation, the crises that, as Dr. Walton so rightly named, are crises of formation, not only with people of our faith, but with people of faith who cling to a vision of a more perfect union and a more perfect world, and commit generation after generation to becoming people who affirm the dignity of all God's children. Thank you.
Well, greetings. Dr. Walton, my brother, it's always a privilege to hear you speak. Once again, my mind and my heart is stirring by your words. Thank you for a lecture that is compelling, convicting, and hopeful. Hopeful. And I want to resonate with the conviction. I'm Eustacia Moffett Marshall. I serve New River, which is home to First African Presbyterian Church, founded in 1807. And as I process the remarks, I resonate with the conviction also that you've heard from my colleagues, Sudie and Barron, that the deepest crises confronting our nation are not merely political disagreements, but crises of formation. And we heard that democracy is not ultimately sustained by constitutions and courts and institutions, but by citizens whose character has been formed and often formed in faith communities, shaped by an ethic of love and justice. Of course, we know that not all faith communities purport the same values. The Jesus that William Steele and James Miller McKim was shaped by, that Jesus that moved them toward acts of abolition, is also the same faith invoked by the slaveholder to justify enslavement. So as the lecture encourages us, we are confronted with the call towards moral imagination and an ethic of compassion and justice to inform who we are to become. And that same Protestant prophetic progressive tradition of the Black church is, I believe, one pocket of hope. The nation's oldest Black Presbyterian church, First African, which is now part of New River, is part of the tradition that formed people, as Dr. Walton mentioned, formed people for a kind of somebodyness within our fragile democracy, through preaching dignity of Black people and ministries of mutual aid that Dr. Walton talked about, supporting ministries of education and literacy, and partnering with abolitionists. First African is a witness to the ways in which faith communities have shaped and continue to form people to be moral citizens in this fragile democracy. And when I consider the history of First African and congregations like it, I'm acutely aware that the work of formation has never been without a cost. For me, the crisis of formation raises the question about the cost of formation. And as I have been wrestling with the lecture, it's the cost of formation that keeps coming back to me. That formation is not simply the acquisition of new virtues, it is the surrender of the falsehoods we have become comfortable believing. It is allowing the truth to dismantle the lies that have shaped our imaginations, our relationships, our institutions. It calls us to confront the histories we have sanitized and the habits that keep us from loving God and our neighbors. And history teaches us that those who are most invested in maintaining a hierarchy of human value have often responded to that truth with violence. Still, Reverend Dr. Katie Cannon told us, even when they call the truth a lie, tell it anyway. So as we commemorate the 250th anniversary of our nation, we hear many stories about America. The question is whether we have the courage to tell the truth and share the whole story. Not to diminish our nation, but out of love for this nation. Love that refuses sentimentality. We heard Dr. Walton talk about that. This is not a Pollyanna sentimental kind of love, but love that's strong enough to tell the truth about our contradictions, that the America we call the land of the free and home of the brave still imagines itself as a white republic. That's a truth that we're called to lament, repair, and reconcile, all of which is part of our vocation in the body of Christ. And when I think about the cost of formation, I think of Reverend John Gloucester, organizing pastor of First African. He celebrates 250 years, his birthday. He was born into slavery in 1776. The same year, the Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all people are created equal. Gloucester's conditions embodies the contradictions of our nation's founding. After being released from enslavement by a Presbyterian minister, he came to Philadelphia while members of his own family remained enslaved. He founded First African Presbyterian Church, but he also risked his own freedom by returning to the South in dangerous efforts to secure theirs. The work is costly. The work of formation is hard. I think of my great-grandfather. My grandmother tells the story of the trauma she experienced when he left home to vote. He would have a journey to get to the polls, and given the threats of the KKK, my grandmother tells the story that her mother would be crying hysterically, "Daddy may never come home." The cost. Great-granddaddy was a pastor. Great-granddaddy believed that what he was doing was part of what God called him to do. And for my family and for so many, voting was never merely a civic act. It was an act of faith and courage. Costly discipleship for people who believed that God had given dignity and a voice to shape a more just and equitable society. We have these witnesses in the church. These are our witnesses in the church. And we are reminded that while the work of moral formation has never been easy, that it requires courage, sacrifice, yet it's happening because we are still here. We are sitting, all of us, in the fruit of someone else's moral formation. Somebody declared not yet in the not now. Somebody sang freedom before freedom ever arrived. Somebody opened the church doors to the weary, to a freedom seeker. Somebody marched. Somebody preached dignity. Somebody loved their enemies without surrendering their dignity. And now the question turns to us, the question we live with as a church, as a community. Who are we to become, which Dr. Walton has lifted up for us, and are we willing to become it? Because the cost of formation takes courage. Thank you.
Wow. Just real briefly, I went to college in the early 90s. Be brief, but I'm going somewhere with this. Brother Barron, you triggered this in me. I went to college in the early 90s. As I alluded to, I attended a prestigious African-American male institution, Morehouse College in Atlanta. And there, in the 1980s, out of Morehouse and Spelman College, there was a spring break gathering that started to develop in the 1980s. That by the early 90s, or late 80s, early 90s, had taken on the name Freaknik. Hulu did a documentary about a year or two ago on the history of Freaknik. It got shut down for a little while, but then production kicked back up. And during that period of a couple of years, among African Americans of a certain age who are now judges, physicians, lawyers, elected officials, mayors, seminary presidents, and parents to students who are now at places like Morehouse, and my daughter was a Spelman. There was a generation that was literally sweating bullets. Because God knows what was on somebody's video camera. I can see in your faces, some of you are thinking back to your college years right now. Thank God for the blood of Jesus. My grace is sufficient for you. Barron, you reminded me of this because you reminded me of the importance of always holding in tension that people can be profoundly faithful and profoundly flawed. That's all of us, of every generation. And when we think about intergenerational tensions, for those of us who are raising children and grandchildren, sometimes it's good to just take a walk down memory lane to evoke a little epistemic and moral humility before we cast judgments on this generation that's going to hell in a handbasket. Sometimes it's good to just take a walk down memory lane to just remember that the very things that you're judging other people for are often some of the same hopes, desires, dreams, and ambitions and or vain desires that animate you and me. And that's what I so appreciate about your reflections, Brother Barron, is that this point of humility. And when we talk about formation, right, when we talk about formation, we have to understand that it's not perfect, but we cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater. Because we understand that even in our imperfection, that there can be enough gospel to make its way through. So thank you. And, in Sudie's point about expanding it even beyond my talks to talk about the importance of interfaith dialogue, which I think is such an important reminder for all of us, and how the work of formation that happens in all of our faith community, right? We don't have to be doctrinally consistent to be morally aligned, right? Just like we don't have to be racially or ethnically identified to be morally clear and consistent and cooperative with one another. And the work is so hard. That's why we have to remember and remind ourselves. And I'm literally, while you were talking, Sudie, the words of a beloved professor, Dr. Geddes Hansen, who had his roots here in the Philadelphia Presbytery, came to me. And he used to say all the time, if it's easy, it's unnecessary. If it's easy, it's unnecessary. And then just finally, Eustacia is so right. There's always competing theologies. There's always dueling conceptions of even humanity. There's always a counter narrative and a counter story. There are those who align with Moses, and there are those whose faith teaches them to align with Pharaoh. That has always been the case in this nation. And for that reason, I think formation is even that much more important. And when I say formation is important, it's important that we own what we're doing in formation. Because formation is taking place somewhere. It's happening whether we agree with it or not. And so we can complain about what they're doing over there in those congregations, or we can take some ownership and responsibility and actually have pride and conviction, even still grounded in humility, that we know a better way. And when I think about the pride grounded in humility, I'm thinking of Pauli Murray, the extraordinary Episcopal priest who coined the term Jane Crow to describe the paradox of being a woman, and then, of course, now what we would describe as a non-binary person, dealing with the systemic injustice of gender exclusion from the very churches and Black institutions of which she was a part. She was having to deal with Jim Crow from alienation from white establishment, like being denied access to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, of where one of her white foreparents was actual trustee. Being denied admission there, but then also being denied access at places like Howard Law because of Black male patriarchy. But yet she knew a better way. And that's why she said, whenever my brethren feel the need to draw a circle to exclude me. I draw a bigger circle to include them. That's formation. That's knowing a better way and still being grounded in both conviction and humility. Thank you all for your extraordinary words. And thank you all for your engagement. Thank you.